The silver dinner knife in my hand trembled when my daughter leaned in and whispered, "You're not needed here." Still, I pressed the blade flat against the linen, forcing my breath steady as her words echoed like a quiet cut. As the soft clatter of plates drifted around us, that cold metal seemed to grow heavier, reminding me who paid for every seat at that table. While its chill settled into my palm, the truth settled too. She wasn't dismissing me. She was erasing me. The same knife that once carved her birthday cakes now traced the edge of my resolve. That's when I decided. If she no longer needed me at her table, I would take back the entire house. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The evening air was warm with a slight breeze, brushing against the fine linens of the outdoor terrace where the dinner was being held. Charleston's signature charm hung in the atmosphere, gilded and nostalgic like a piece of antique silver. Eleanor Whitmore, in a crisp navy dress and a string of pearls, stood at the entrance, the distant hum of clinking glasses and soft laughter coming from inside. She was early, though not as early as she used to be. She spotted Isabel immediately. Her daughter was the picture of grace, with a smile that could sell anything and everything. Isabel's outfit was sleek and modern, something Eleanor would never wear. But it wasn't her appearance that caught Eleanor's attention. It was the way she moved through the room, her guests parted for her like waves before a ship. Every inch of Isabel was calculated for effect, every word meticulously chosen for the audience. Eleanor was just another member of the crowd, just another guest at this celebration, as Isabel had so carefully labeled it. She was here because, despite what Isabel had planned for the evening, it was Eleanor's money that funded most of this, her estate, her connections, her vision. Eleanor had watched the setup unfold, the way the tables were arranged, the delicate china, the high-end floral arrangements. Isabel had clearly gone all out. But there was one thing Eleanor had noticed immediately: her seat. Near the kitchen. Again. The small table at the back of the room, tucked behind an archway of potted plants, was where they'd placed her. She could already hear the staff clattering behind her as the dinner unfolded. The clinking of plates, the shuffle of feet. They had made her invisible, a subtle reminder of the space she now occupied. Isabel's voice echoed through the room, speaking to the donors, the social elite of Charleston, as she stood at the podium. "I'm so proud of how far we've come," Isabel's voice rang out bright and full of pride. "The Morris legacy, what we've built together. It's all because of each of you." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. There was no mention of her, no acknowledgement that the very mansion they were seated in, the wealth they flaunted, the connections they now claimed were all from her hands. She could feel the weight of it settling on her chest, but she didn't flinch. She remained still, letting the wine slide over her tongue, cool against the heat rising in her chest. The applause followed Isabel's speech, and Eleanor clapped politely, her eyes lingering on her daughter. Isabel was a portrait of success, standing with her arms open, basking in the adoration of the crowd. But to Eleanor, there was something unsettling about the way Isabel had folded herself into the fabric of this world, too eager, too desperate to fit in, to take ownership of what was never truly hers. Eleanor had built this, brick by brick, and now Isabel was trying to reframe it as her own creation. After the dinner, the guests dispersed into small groups, but Eleanor remained at her seat, unwilling to be forgotten. She caught Isabel's eye from across the room. Her daughter made no attempt to come to her. Eleanor stood, smoothing down her dress, and walked toward Isabel. "You did a beautiful job," Eleanor said quietly, her voice calm but firm. She was trying, at least, to be gracious. It wasn't often she could manage kindness these days, but Isabel had always been her weakness. She had never wanted to be anything but proud of her daughter. But Isabel barely glanced at her. She was too busy chatting with some wealthy donor, laughing at something he had said. It was only when Eleanor stopped directly in front of her that she finally acknowledged her mother, eyes flicking up briefly. "Thanks, Mom. I'll be with you in a minute." Eleanor's lips pressed together, but she said nothing. She could feel the walls closing in around her. It was always like this. Always a polite, cold dismissal of her presence, her opinion, her worth. The truth that Isabel so desperately wanted to hide. Eleanor had made her. But Isabel, it seemed, had forgotten that. It wasn't until the room had mostly cleared, the last of the guests slipping out into the humid night air, that Isabel finally turned to her mother. "Mom?" she said, her voice suddenly sharp, cutting through the silence. "You're not needed here anymore." The words hit Eleanor like a slap, but she didn't flinch. She met her daughter's gaze with cool detachment, the weight of all the years between them hanging heavy in the air. For a moment, Eleanor said nothing. She didn't need to say anything. She simply looked at Isabel, absorbing the sharp edges of the dismissal, the cold indifference. She wasn't needed. She had been a fixture, a tool to be used but never appreciated. Not anymore. Eleanor turned, walking toward the exit, her back straight and unwavering. The air outside was thick with the scent of jasmine, and though she hadn't been invited, though she had been deliberately overlooked and diminished, Eleanor knew one thing. It was her name, her legacy, that had made this all possible. And Isabel? Isabel would see just how necessary she still was. The dinner had ended, but the real story was just beginning. Eleanor sat at her desk, the mahogany surface gleaming beneath the soft light of the desk lamp. The papers spread before her were familiar, the details of the trust she had built over decades of hard work and sacrifice. Her fingers brushed over the legal documents, her mind sharp as a blade. The house, the firm, the vacation property, all of it. Her name was still there, etched into every line, every clause. The family's wealth, their legacy, the life Isabel and her husband were so eager to claim, was still under her control. The sound of the clock ticking in the silence of her study was oddly soothing. She wasn't surprised, not in the least, but the reality still stung. Isabel had promised investors that she had inherited full control of the family assets. The idea had been sold to the highest bidder, and now, Isabel was playing the part of the successful, powerful woman. But as Eleanor turned each page, her fingers tightened ever so slightly. It was all a lie. The trust had been clear. Only one signature was needed for any major changes, and it was hers, not Isabel's. She had built this empire, not her daughter. The thought settled coldly in her chest. Isabel had lied to everyone, including herself. She thought she could erase Eleanor, rewrite history, take everything that had been carefully crafted and call it her own. But Eleanor had other plans. As the pages passed in front of her, Eleanor's phone buzzed. It was a message from Grace. "She's in over her head, Eleanor. This is fraud by omission." Eleanor's lips quirked into a bitter smile. Grace knew as well as she did that Isabel had been playing a dangerous game, one that had already begun to unravel. Eleanor set the papers down and dialed the number she knew by heart. Frank's voice was steady when he picked up. "Eleanor." "Isabel thinks she's in charge, Frank," she said, leaning back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the darkening sky outside the window. "She's promised full control to investors, but it's all built on a lie. She's been playing pretend with my portfolio." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Frank spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "We'll fix it. You want to restructure? Then let's do it the right way." Eleanor took a deep breath. The weight of what she had to do next settled around her like an anchor, but it wasn't heavy with regret. It was heavy with purpose. "I want Isabel excluded from anything I can manage. The trust, the estate, the firm. She won't get a dime if I can help it." "I'll handle it," Frank replied, the certainty in his tone making Eleanor's jaw tighten. As the conversation ended, Eleanor glanced back down at the papers on her desk. She was already making moves. This wasn't just about money, it was about power, about respect. And Isabel had made the fatal mistake of thinking she could control something that had never been hers to begin with. Later that week, Eleanor stood in her garden, watching as the last of the evening light faded behind the trees. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine, and the garden, her pride and joy, whispered of years of careful design. She hadn't let herself linger in the shadows of this life, and she wasn't about to now. From where she stood, she could see Isabel's husband, Doug, walking up the front steps of a realtor's office. He looked every bit the ambitious man trying to carve out his own path in Charleston society, but his plan was clear. They wanted to repurpose the family home, turn it into some trendy event property, stripping it of everything it had been, everything it stood for. Eleanor's fingers twitched, but she didn't move from her spot in the garden. She wasn't going to fight this out in public. Not yet. She'd learned long ago that power was most effective when it was wielded quietly, carefully. She turned back to the house and walked into her study, her steps deliberate. The phone call with Frank had left her calm, but that didn't mean she was done. Not by a long shot. She reached for her phone and dialed the county office. She'd instructed Frank to handle the paperwork, but she needed to do this herself. With steady fingers, she began the process of filing title freeze notifications, ensuring that none of Isabel's actions would be able to touch the properties until further notice. It was a move that would secure everything for now, a silent, immovable wall between what was hers and what Isabel had planned to steal. As the title freeze was officially filed, Eleanor leaned back in her chair. The cool evening air swept through the open window, but it did nothing to cool the heat of satisfaction in her chest. This was just the beginning. Isabel had pushed her too far. And now, the game was on. Eleanor sat at the head of the polished oak table, the steam from her tea curling upward in slow spirals. Her hands, steady as ever, cradled the delicate porcelain cup. The soft clink of fine china was the only sound in the room, a quiet contrast to the brewing storm that simmered beneath the surface. She'd invited Isabel and Doug over under the pretense of discussing the future, of making plans, as if this was merely another business meeting. But Eleanor knew the truth. They were there to negotiate what they assumed was their birthright, their claim to what they thought was theirs. The room was dim, the only light coming from the crystal chandelier overhead, casting soft shadows across the space. Eleanor's home, like her, was an enduring symbol of a life built slowly, carefully, each room a reflection of a decision made with purpose. Her guests, however, were too eager to rip it all apart. Isabel and Doug arrived punctually, their clothes too new, too sharp, too eager. Isabel was smiling, a perfect rehearsed smile, the kind that slipped easily onto her face when she needed to charm someone. Doug's face was a mask of calculated civility, but Eleanor could see the underlying hunger in his eyes. They both thought they had her cornered. Isabel spoke first, her tone sweet, but with that underlying edge of entitlement. "We've been talking," she said, settling into one of the chairs across from Eleanor. "We want to renovate the house, turn it into something profitable, an event venue, a place for society galas. It could bring in a lot of money." Doug slid a piece of paper across the table with a smooth motion, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. It was a rough draft of a family usage agreement, a thinly veiled attempt to take control of the property, to mark it as their own while keeping Eleanor's name attached to it. They'd planned this, of course, Isabel's ambition and Doug's vision meshing into one tidy, profitable scheme. Eleanor's eyes lingered on the paper, her fingers brushing across its surface before she lifted her gaze to meet Isabel's, then Doug's. Without a word, she slid her own document across the table. The copy of the trust. It was stark in its simplicity, and Eleanor let the weight of it settle between them. The trust was clear, completely intact, fully in her name. There was no room for doubt. Isabel's hand stilled over the paper she had been fiddling with, and for a brief moment the silence hung thick, broken only by the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. "Is this a joke?" Isabel asked, her voice wavering for the first time. Eleanor didn't flinch. She only sipped her tea, letting the quiet hum of her own calm fill the space. "You've been playing pretend with my portfolio, Isabel," she said, her voice low, almost conversational. "But it was never yours to control." Doug shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes flickering between Eleanor and Isabel. His jaw clenched as if he were searching for something to say, some defense, but none came. Isabel's face flushed crimson. Eleanor could see the effort it took for her to maintain the facade of composure, but it was slipping. The woman who once relied on charm and presentation now found herself cornered by the reality of her mother's control, the very thing she had been trying to overwrite for so long. Eleanor allowed a brief, almost imperceptible smile to curve her lips. This moment, this shift in power, felt sweeter than any victory. It was not about the money, not entirely. It was about restoring the balance, reclaiming what had been hers from the moment Isabel had taken it for granted. "Mom, we can work something out," Isabel said, her voice sharp now, though there was a tremor beneath it. "This doesn't have to be an issue. We've built something here, something meaningful. We can all benefit from it." Eleanor shook her head, her eyes cool. "No, Isabel," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. "You've already made your choice. You chose to disrespect me, to rewrite my life. But what you failed to understand is that this—" she gestured to the house, the papers, the life they were discussing, "isn't just about money. It's about respect. And you have none." The words hit harder than any slap. Doug's face went pale, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. Isabel, meanwhile, sat frozen, her eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and a dawning, ugly understanding of what was happening. Grace, who had been standing at the back of the room, observing silently, took a step forward, her expression one of quiet triumph. The game was no longer just Eleanor's to play, it was theirs too. Eleanor's gaze remained steady on Isabel, watching as the realization sank in. The floor had shifted beneath her daughter's feet, and there was no graceful way to step back. Isabel cleared her throat, trying to regain some semblance of control. "This is ridiculous, Mom. You're overreacting. We can make this work. We can—" "No, Isabel," Eleanor interrupted, her voice a final, definitive edge. "You had your chance, and you chose to lie. Now, I'm rewriting the terms." With that, Eleanor stood, the room seemingly shrinking around them as her presence expanded, filling every corner. She reached for the trust, gathering the papers neatly into a folder. "You're going to have to find another way to make your mark," Eleanor added softly, her voice carrying the weight of a mother who had waited far too long to say those words. "But it won't be here." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Doug opened his mouth as if to argue, but no words came out. Isabel just stared at her, her face pale, her ambition crumbling before her. Eleanor turned her back to them, already dismissing them from her mind. The game had changed, and Isabel had just lost. Eleanor sat in her study, the soft hum of the city outside mingling with the rustling of papers as she carefully examined the latest report in front of her. She had been thorough, always had been, but even she couldn't have anticipated the depth of Isabel's deceit. Isabel had always had a talent for manipulation, a way of presenting herself as the victim while deftly stitching her own web of control. It was a game Eleanor had never fully understood, not until now. The details of the bank records in front of her were damning. Isabel had used her own last name to secure a private line of credit, the same name that had built this life. The name Eleanor had painstakingly forged into a legacy. With a few well-placed phone calls and the same charm that had fooled so many before, Isabel had secured millions in loans, all under the guise of inheriting control of the family estate. A pang of disbelief shot through Eleanor, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she folded the papers carefully and set them aside. There was no rush. There was time. The slow burn of justice would catch up to Isabel, no matter how much she tried to outrun it. Grace Halley, ever the meticulous partner, had been digging through records as well. Eleanor hadn't even needed to ask. Grace had already pieced together the full story, sending Eleanor a summary that confirmed what she'd suspected. She had trusted Isabel, believed in her potential, and now, she's 3 months from foreclosure. Eleanor, Grace had said over the phone. All the while, she's been spinning this narrative, taking out loans she can't possibly repay. And she's using your name to do it. If anyone gets wind of this, she's finished. Eleanor had only nodded as she processed the information, her mind already working its way through the next steps. Isabel had played her hand too early, relying on borrowed time. But Eleanor was never one to be rushed. This was about timing, precision. If Isabel wanted to gamble with the family legacy, she would soon find out how high the stakes were. Eleanor reached for her phone and dialed Frank. He picked up after the first ring. "Send her a letter, Frank," Eleanor said, her voice cold and calculated, revoking her access to any and all family assets. "She doesn't get a penny more." "I'll have it drafted immediately," Frank replied, his voice steady. Eleanor didn't wait for another word. She hung up and leaned back in her chair, staring out of the window as the shadows grew long across the city. There was something satisfying about it, watching her daughter's life begin to unravel with each passing day, knowing that she had orchestrated it all from behind the scenes. But Eleanor didn't feel the rush of victory. Not yet. The following morning, Eleanor made her way into the formal dining room where her family's charitable foundation's donation fund had been set up. Isabel had insisted on using Eleanor's name in a joint donor initiative, a slick public relations move designed to bolster her own reputation. But Eleanor had never approved of it. And now, it was time to remove herself from the equation entirely. She opened the document, carefully removing her name from the fund with a single stroke of the pen. The words seemed final, their weight heavier than any action she had taken before. Isabel had betrayed the trust of not just Eleanor, but everyone who had contributed to the family's name. The following morning, the press release that had celebrated the launch of Isabel's charity was quietly retracted. The silence that followed was telling, and by the time the public could even begin to ask questions, Eleanor's hands were already clean. At 11:23 a.m., Eleanor received a call. The number on the screen was Isabel's. For a moment, Eleanor just stared at the phone, the weight of it all settling in the pit of her stomach. Isabel was panicked, desperate to fix the unraveling mess she had created. Eleanor could almost hear the tremor in her voice even without answering the call. She didn't pick up. Instead, Eleanor set the phone back down on the polished desk, watching as it vibrated with each new attempt. Her heart didn't race. It never did. She had spent too many years building her life for it to be torn apart by someone else's lies. Isabel's phone calls, her desperate pleas, they no longer had any power over her. Eleanor stood and walked to the window, her reflection meeting her in the glass. The city outside seemed to mock her at times, a world that had no idea of the quiet power she wielded. Isabel, however, was about to learn. The sound of the phone ringing again was distant now, like the fading echo of a memory. Eleanor turned her back on it, her mind already far ahead, plotting the next steps. She wasn't going to answer Isabel's calls, not until the final curtain had fallen and everything that was hers had been returned to its rightful place. Eleanor Whitmore was no longer a woman to be ignored. Not by her daughter. Not by anyone. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tapping absently against the polished wood. The house was quiet, too quiet almost, as the late afternoon sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over everything. It felt like a different time, a time when she would have been here with a family, laughter echoing through the halls, the scent of freshly baked bread mixing with the undertones of jasmine from the garden outside. Now, it was just her, alone in the home she had worked so hard to build. But there was something different now. Something Eleanor hadn't expected. The quiet was no longer suffocating. It had become a sanctuary. The doorbell rang, breaking her reverie. Eleanor stood up and made her way to the front door, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floors. She opened it to find Caroline, standing there with a small suitcase by her side. The 12-year-old's face lit up when she saw her grandmother, her eyes sparkling with the innocence that only the young seem to possess. "Grandma," Caroline said, her voice warm and full of excitement. "Come in, darling," Eleanor said with a smile, stepping aside to let Caroline pass. It had been a while since she'd spent time alone with her granddaughter. Isabel had always been the center of attention, but Caroline? She was different. Caroline saw things that others didn't, things that her mother never did. Caroline wasted no time, darting into the living room and flopping down on the sofa. "What are we going to do first?" Eleanor couldn't help but smile. "Well, first we're going to have some tea. After that, I'll show you something I've been working on." Caroline tilted her head, curious. "Something for the house?" "Yes," Eleanor said, walking to the kitchen and beginning to prepare the tea. "I've been sketching some new ideas. Maybe you'll like them." Caroline wandered into the study, her footsteps light as she gazed at the drawings strewn across the desk. She picked up one of the sketches, turning it in her hands with the care of someone who understood the weight of a line, the subtle curve of a space. Eleanor watched her from the doorway, her heart swelling with pride. Caroline had always been the observant one. While Isabel had chased the trappings of wealth and status, Caroline had looked deeper, noticing the art in the details. It was a gift Eleanor had once seen in herself, back when she was starting out, before the world had placed its demands on her. They sat together in the quiet of the study, the teacups resting on the table between them, as Eleanor began to show Caroline how to sketch the curves of a chair, the flow of a room. Caroline was eager, her pencil moving across the paper with surprising skill. There was something about her that reminded Eleanor of herself, before the pressure, before the compromises. As the day wore on, the conversation naturally turned to Isabel. Eleanor hadn't pushed it, but Caroline couldn't help herself. "You know, Mom talked about you at that dinner party," Caroline said, glancing up from her sketch. "She said you have dated taste." Eleanor's fingers stilled for a moment, her eyes locking onto Caroline's. She hadn't been expecting that. "Did she now?" Eleanor's voice was calm, almost amused. Caroline nodded, her eyes wide. "She said your style is old-fashioned and it just doesn't fit anymore." Eleanor's lips curved into a faint smile, though there was no warmth in it. "Your mother is welcome to her opinion, darling," she said, her voice smooth and steady, as if the words didn't touch her at all. "But it's not my work." Caroline bit her lip, her eyes shifting uncomfortably. "I don't think she gets it. I think she doesn't see how much you built, how hard you worked." Eleanor's smile softened, just a fraction. "Sometimes people forget what goes into making something last." Caroline set her pencil down and crossed the room to Eleanor, her small hands reaching out. Without a word, she wrapped her arms around her grandmother in a tight hug, pressing her cheek against Eleanor's shoulder. "You're the only one who built anything," Caroline whispered, the sincerity in her voice cutting through the tension that had hung in the room. Eleanor's hand rested on the back of her granddaughter's head, her fingers smoothing over the soft hair. For a brief moment, Eleanor felt the weight of the years lift from her shoulders, replaced by the quiet, steady strength of the young girl in her arms. It wasn't just about the legacy Eleanor had fought for. It was about the truth. And Caroline was the one who saw it. For the first time in a long while, Eleanor allowed herself to feel something other than the cold, calculating resolve she'd cultivated over the years. She had done what needed to be done. Everything that had been taken from her, she was reclaiming. And now, with Caroline, there was something more. Something worth protecting. As they pulled apart, Eleanor looked into Caroline's eyes. "You're very wise, my dear, and you have a great future ahead of you. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Caroline nodded, her smile small but filled with the unspoken understanding that passed between them. Eleanor stood, walking to the desk and retrieving a new sketch, one she had been working on quietly in the back of her mind. She set it in front of Caroline, her voice low but full of quiet intention. "This is what I want to show you next. A legacy that's built to last." Caroline leaned forward, studying the sketch with wide, fascinated eyes. And in that moment, Eleanor knew. Whatever came next, whatever her daughter had planned, her legacy would not only endure, it would evolve, shaped by the hands of those who truly understood its worth. And Isabel would have no say in it. The sun filtered softly through the curtains of Eleanor's study, casting long shadows across the room. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine drifting in from the garden, but it was Eleanor's sharp focus that filled the space. She sat with a cup of tea in her hand, her fingers curled around the delicate porcelain as she watched the screen of her laptop. Beside her, Grace sat in the armchair, her presence a quiet force of its own. The two women had spent years building the life Eleanor had earned, and now they watched it unravel on the screen. Isabel had given an interview earlier that morning, speaking with practiced charm to one of the city's most prominent magazines. "The Morris women come from long Charleston tradition," Isabel had said, her words smooth as velvet, each sentence calculated to paint the picture of a family legacy she claimed to inherit. Eleanor knew better. She'd heard the words countless times before. But today, it was different. Eleanor didn't react, not outwardly. Instead, she sipped her tea, the warmth of it providing a strange contrast to the coldness in her veins. Grace didn't say anything either, but her eyes flicked between Eleanor and the screen, knowing the storm was coming. "Is she really trying to pass herself off as the heir to your life?" Grace asked, her voice low, almost amused. Eleanor's lips barely curved into a smile. "She's trying to claim something that was never hers to take." On the screen, Isabel's face was radiant, the perfect image of someone who had worked her whole life to preserve the legacy of the Morris family. It was a performance, one designed to make the public forget where it all began, forget that the life they now claimed was built from the ground up by Eleanor Whitmore. Isabel spoke of vision and tradition, a story that twisted history into a new narrative. "She's branding your life without the licensing rights." Frank's voice suddenly crackled through the speakerphone, breaking the silence that had fallen in the room. Eleanor hadn't needed to ask him to look into Isabel's actions. He had been doing so quietly for days, collecting the evidence, preparing for the inevitable. The legal system would be their final battleground. Eleanor set her teacup down on the table with an audible clink. "Then it's time to take back what's mine." Grace raised an eyebrow, a smirk curling at the corner of her lips. "What are you thinking?" Eleanor turned to Grace, her gaze steady. "It's time to file for copyright. My design firm's branding, the portfolio archive, every piece of it belongs to me, and it always will." Grace nodded, her fingers tapping against her glass as she thought through the logistics. "It'll shut her down, no question." Eleanor's expression remained unreadable. "It will stop her from using what isn't hers. And if she wants to play in my world, she'll have to do it by my rules." Later that day, the paperwork was filed. Eleanor's hands moved with precision, her fingers dancing over the keys as she officially claimed what was rightfully hers. The trademark registration for her old design firm, Whitmore Interiors, was now in place, along with the copyrights to the entire design archive. It was a quiet, methodical act, but one that sent a clear message to Isabel and anyone who thought they could erase Eleanor's legacy. By the following morning, the first of the consequences had arrived. Isabel's website, which had been touting her ownership of the Morris family brand, was flagged by the hosting service for copyright infringement. The screen in front of Eleanor displayed the warning in bold red letters. This site has been taken offline due to unauthorized use of intellectual property. Eleanor watched, unmoving, as the screen refreshed. A wave of satisfaction washed over her. But she didn't show it. There was no need for triumph, not yet. This was only the beginning. A few hours later, Eleanor received a call from Frank. His voice was thick with the satisfaction of a job well done. "We've got her, Eleanor. Doug tried to appeal the takedown notice, but it won't go anywhere. I've sent a cease and desist letter to their attorneys. This is going to stop her cold." Eleanor's lips twitched in approval. "Good. Let her see how difficult it is to steal from me." Grace, still sitting across from Eleanor, gave a small, satisfied nod. She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms as she studied Eleanor. "You've played the long game, haven't you?" Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She simply watched the screen, her expression contemplative. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken understanding. Isabel's rise had been swift, her ambitions bold, but she had underestimated the force of the foundation Eleanor had built. Isabel had thought she could simply step into the picture, take what she wanted, and continue her climb. But Eleanor was no longer the invisible figure in the background. She was the force that shaped the future. Just then, the phone buzzed again, Isabel's name flashing across the screen. Eleanor glanced at it, but she didn't answer. There was no rush to hear what her daughter had to say. She had been warned, but she hadn't listened. Now, it was too late. Grace spoke again, breaking the moment. "Isabel's about to learn that the game she's playing is one you wrote the rules for." Eleanor turned to Grace, her expression hardening as she glanced at the screen. "Let her learn. Let them all learn." She picked up the phone but didn't answer. Instead, she swiped it away, cutting off the connection. "Legacy," Eleanor murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "It's not about what they take. It's about what you leave behind and what they can never touch." The message had been sent. Isabel had made her move. Now it was Eleanor's turn. The press release was succinct, direct, and poised to make waves. It landed quietly in inboxes across the city, its headline simple yet powerful. Whitmore Interiors. Relaunches with Eleanor Whitmore as founder emeritus. Noah Jensen, the young craftsman Eleanor had mentored years ago, had a steady hand on the helm now. He stood at the forefront of the revived firm, his presence quietly commanding, a new face for a name that had once been synonymous with timeless design. But this wasn't just a relaunch, it was a reclamation. Eleanor sat back in her chair, watching the news unfold in real time. Her fingers curled around the edges of her teacup, her eyes narrowing as she read through the client list that had been reinstated along with the firm. Every name on the list was one that knew her work, respected her legacy. Not Isabel's, not her husband's. Isabel had spent the last few months constructing an image that leaned heavily on borrowed success. But now it was clear to anyone paying attention that she had no claim to the firm. Not anymore. The archives, the designs, the very essence of Whitmore Interiors. All of it was now under Noah's leadership, with Eleanor overseeing the foundation, the heartbeat of it all. As Eleanor read through the emails of congratulation flooding in, the shift in public perception was undeniable. Former clients, people she had worked with for years, were already reposting photos of her classic designs. Her work was resurfacing, being tagged with the new firm's logo, images of spaces she had transformed years ago. But no mention of Isabel, no mention of her husband. The past had been restored. And Isabel? She was nowhere to be found. The first of Isabel's desperate responses came just a few hours later. The email was laced with indignation, filled with accusations that Noah was unqualified to lead such a prestigious firm. Isabel had sent it to a few local influencers and press contacts, trying to drum up some kind of support, some semblance of control over the narrative. But Noah wasn't easily rattled. He had already taken the steps to defend his position. With an air of professionalism, he published his resume, a solid list of accomplishments from years spent learning under Eleanor's watch, and included something that only added weight to his credibility: a glowing letter of recommendation from Eleanor's late husband. The letter was more than just words on paper. It was a testament to Eleanor's belief in him, a nod to the legacy she had forged, and it gave the firm a lineage that Isabel couldn't compete with. Eleanor could already see the fallout as it rippled across social media, but it wasn't her name that was trending. It was Noah's. People were looking to the future, to the young craftsman who was now at the helm, guided by Eleanor's steady hand. Isabel's name, by contrast, was slipping into irrelevance, drowned beneath the weight of the truth. Grace, who had been watching the developments unfold from the other side of the room, smiled knowingly. She stood up, reaching for her phone. With a quick tap, she secured a local ad spot, one that would amplify the message even more. The ad, simple and elegant, ran with a black and white image of a beautifully designed room. Below it, the words read, "Built by hand, restored by legacy." It was a quiet triumph, but a triumphant one all the same. The ad would run across the city, and it would be seen by the right people. In a world that loved to rewrite stories, this was a firm reminder of what had come before, what had shaped the city, and what would endure long after. Eleanor watched the ad take shape on her phone screen, her lips curling into a small, satisfied smile. The narrative was no longer in Isabel's hands. No matter what she tried, no matter how much she screamed about what she thought was hers, the world was looking forward, not back. The next day, the first public blow to Isabel's credibility landed. A local design blog published a piece that dissected the history of Whitmore Interiors, noting the firm's unparalleled influence on Charleston's architectural landscape. They covered Noah's work, detailing the restoration projects that had revived some of the city's most iconic buildings, each one imbued with the timeless elegance that had once been Eleanor's signature. Isabel, meanwhile, remained in the background, clutching at whatever scraps of influence she could still salvage. Her website remained offline, a casualty of the copyright dispute Eleanor had quietly orchestrated. The backlash she faced from clients and partners who had once rallied behind her was swift and unforgiving. The flood of retractions, canceling her exclusive partnerships, retracting their endorsements, was now undeniable. Eleanor didn't need to lift a finger. The city, the industry, the very reputation she had built, it was all working for her now. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt something unexpected, a rush, but not of anger. It was something far simpler. It was peace. In the distance, the doorbell rang. Eleanor stood, smoothing down her dress. There was more work to do, but for now she allowed herself a moment to breathe. She opened the door to find Noah standing there, a broad smile on his face. "We're trending, Eleanor," he said, the pride in his voice unmistakable. "The firm's back, and so is your legacy." Eleanor's smile deepened, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to feel the fullness of it, the weight of years of hard work, and the knowledge that no one, not even Isabel, could take it from her now. Noah's smile faded as he looked around, sensing the weight of what was still to come. "You've got more to do, don't you?" Eleanor's gaze turned back to the window, the sun casting golden light across the city she had helped shape. "Yes," she said softly, "but the game has changed, and Isabel won't be able to rewrite it this time." The door clicked shut behind them. There was a stillness in the room, as if the air itself had stilled in anticipation of what was to come. Eleanor was ready. The room was still. The air in Eleanor's study had thickened with purpose, the sunlight dimming as the last rays of the day began to slip away. On the desk before her lay the papers she had been waiting for. The Whitmore Women's Foundation, an organization she had established years ago to honor the women who had come before her, to give back to the community that had helped build her own family's legacy, was about to undergo a significant change. She had always believed in its mission. She had always believed in what it stood for. But Isabel had turned it into a pawn in her game, using her honorary chair position to amplify her own image, while carefully distancing herself from the foundation's true roots. Isabel had always been a quick learner in the art of presentation, but Eleanor was no longer willing to let her play the part of the matriarch when the foundation had never been hers to claim. The motion was clear: restructure. Eleanor had already outlined the plan. Isabel's title as honorary chair would be revoked immediately, her influence diminished to nothing more than a footnote in the history of the foundation she had so carelessly exploited. This wasn't about punishment. It was about reminding everyone, including Isabel, that some things in life were built on more than just appearance. Some things were held up by structure, by rules, by respect. Eleanor pressed the papers into an envelope and handed them to Grace, who had been standing by her side. Grace's eyes narrowed as she looked at the documents. "You know this won't go over well, right? Isabel will try to make a spectacle out of this." Eleanor's lips twitched into a brief smile. "Let her. The foundation has bylaws for a reason. Optics don't override them." Grace raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed by Eleanor's calm. "I'm glad we're finally on the same page. This is about the bigger picture, not just the spectacle she'll try to make of it." Eleanor nodded, her gaze steady. This foundation was never about optics. It was about legacy, and the rules were set long before Isabel ever thought she could rewrite them. The motion was filed that evening, and by morning, the news broke. The Whitmore Women's Foundation had undergone an official restructuring. Isabel's honorary chair position was revoked. The email circulated quickly among the local society circles, but it wasn't met with the outrage Isabel had expected. Instead, there was a ripple of quiet approval. People who had once admired Isabel's carefully cultivated image now began to question whether she had ever truly understood the values the foundation was meant to uphold. By noon, Doug was at Eleanor's door. His face was a mask of frustration, but beneath it, there was something else: an attempt at negotiation, an attempt to salvage what little of Isabel's reputation remained. "This isn't good for optics, Eleanor," Doug said, his voice tight as he stepped inside, his suit jacket still impeccable despite the clear tension in his posture. Eleanor didn't stand to greet him. She remained seated, her hands folded on the desk in front of her. "Doug," she said, her voice level, "optics don't override bylaws." Doug didn't take the bait. He leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, his gaze flicking to Grace, who was seated in the corner, watching the interaction with quiet amusement. "You know she's going to fight this. You're taking her out of the spotlight completely. You're taking everything from her." "Everything?" Eleanor's voice was sharp now, cutting through the air between them. "I'm not taking anything from her that she didn't already steal from me." Doug shifted, but Eleanor could see the frustration building in him, as if the weight of Isabel's defeat was pressing down on him just as much as it was on her. "You can't erase her this easily. She's built a name for herself, Eleanor. People look up to her." Eleanor stood then, her tall frame filling the room. "Let them look. But let them look at the truth, Doug. Let them see the foundation for what it was always meant to be: A legacy for women who understood the value of hard work, who understood that success is built over time, not overnight. Grace stood then, her voice cutting through the tension. Optics don't matter when the facts are this clear. And the fact is, Isabel has spent the last few months trying to play a part she was never qualified for. Eleanor built this foundation. Isabel just used it for her own gain. Doug didn't respond. He left shortly after, muttering about meetings he had to attend, but the air in the room had shifted. It was only a matter of time before Isabel would try to take this to the public, but Eleanor was ready for it. Later that afternoon, Eleanor stood in the grand hallway of the Whitmore Women's Foundation headquarters, staring at the portrait of Isabel that had hung in the center for years. She had always admired the artistry of the piece, its grandeur, but it never felt quite right. Isabel had never truly earned that place in the family's history. She had never truly earned the respect that the portrait symbolized. Without a word, Eleanor motioned for Grace, who stood by the doorway, her hands folded behind her back. Together, they removed Isabel's portrait from the wall and replaced it with one of Eleanor's own mother. A woman who had laid the foundation for everything that Eleanor had become. A woman whose legacy was far stronger than anything Isabel could claim. As the portrait settled into place, Carolyn wandered into the room, her eyes wide as she took in the change. She stepped forward, her hand hovering just above the frame. "Grandma," Caroline whispered, her voice quiet but full of awe. She'd be proud. Eleanor's heart tightened at the words. For all that she had built, for all the power she had reclaimed, it was this moment, the quiet recognition of the true legacy, that mattered most. Eleanor's gaze softened as she looked at her granddaughter. She would be. The portrait of her mother stared back, a reminder of the strength and resilience that had passed down through generations. The foundation was theirs, now and forever. Isabel had never truly understood that. The city buzzed with the usual hum, unaware of the quiet storm that was about to unfold. Isabel had given her interview days ago, with the kind of polished ease that had always made her seem more capable than she truly was. She spoke of family legacy, of long-held traditions, and of the Morris women's place in Charleston's elite social circles. But for Eleanor, the words had come like daggers. Each sentence a calculated attempt to erase the past and claim what she never built. But Eleanor, true to form, didn't respond in kind. She didn't give interviews. She didn't raise her voice in public. Instead, she sat in the quiet of her study, the evening light casting long shadows across the room, and composed her thoughts with the precision only someone who had lived through decades of both triumph and betrayal could manage. 3 handwritten letters, one to each of the city's top editors. The words on the page were measured but powerful, a slow burn that would gather strength as it spread. They didn't attack. They didn't retaliate. Instead, they laid bare the facts. Eleanor didn't need to fight the narrative. She would rewrite it. The letters were sent. Within days, the result of her quiet work hit the local papers. The op-ed ran under the headline, "Elegance Without Entitlement." The words in the piece were both a defense of Eleanor's legacy and a subtle dissection of Isabel's claim to it. There was no bitterness, no rage in Eleanor's writing, just the calm assertion that true legacy was earned, not inherited. It was the kind of public statement Isabel had never understood, a dignified truth that could not be taken away. The response was immediate. Emails flooded in from clients, former students, and civic leaders, all offering their support. The community had been waiting for someone to speak the truth. Eleanor had been the architect of Charleston's architectural renaissance, the woman behind the designs that had shaped the city's skyline. But more than that, she had been a quiet force in the lives of those she mentored. She had shaped others into leaders, just as she had built her own empire. It was an outpouring of respect, of gratitude. Eleanor's name once again was trending, But this time, it was trending for the right reasons. The firm's clients shared stories of their experiences working with her, their praise flowing in her direction like a steady river. The truth was undeniable. Eleanor Whitmore was the heart of Charleston's design legacy. And Isabel? Isabel's carefully constructed world began to crack. Eleanor watched as, piece by piece, Isabel's narrative started to unravel. A fact-checker for the local paper had picked up on discrepancies in Isabel's interview. Her comments about her supposed role in the family legacy were scrutinized, examined, and exposed for what they were: fabrications. The magazine's retraction was swift. Isabel's words, once gilded with privilege, now lay bare for all to see. The carefully crafted image she had projected was starting to fall apart in the wake of the facts. Eleanor didn't gloat. She never did. She didn't need to. Isabel was being unmasked by the truth she had tried so hard to bury. But the consequences of Isabel's deception didn't stop with the press. Doug, always quick to play the role of Isabel's defender, found himself in the firing line. A cease and desist letter from Frank, Eleanor's lawyer, landed on Doug's desk within hours. The letter was clear: slander by association. Isabel's claims, Doug's half-hearted support of them, had now come back to haunt him. He was legally bound to retract his statements or face the consequences of defamation. Doug's phone calls to Eleanor had become desperate, but she didn't answer. She didn't need to. Then came the final blow, the one that stung more than all the rest. Caroline, Eleanor's beloved granddaughter, the one who had been with her through the quiet rebuild of the legacy, the one who had known what was real all along. Caroline's school called. She had been pulled from private school, not because of anything she had done, but because of the drama surrounding her family. The administrators cited the public nature of the situation and the potential for emotional distress. The message was clear. Isabel's chaos was now spilling into Caroline's life. Eleanor's heart clenched when she heard the news. She had worked so hard to shield Caroline from all of this, to protect her from the fallout of Isabel's recklessness. But now, it seemed, the damage had been done. She stood by the window, watching the sunlight dip lower in the sky, the city outside aglow with the soft hues of dusk. Caroline had been through so much already. She was strong. Eleanor had taught her that. But this was different. This was the collateral damage of Isabel's ambition, and Eleanor would make sure it was the last time Caroline was affected by it. Caroline will be fine, Eleanor murmured to herself, her reflection in the glass unwavering. But it was a lie she told herself to steady her nerves. The truth was, she would never stop fighting for her granddaughter, not for 1 second. The phone on her desk rang. Eleanor didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. Isabel. She had no doubt that this was a last-ditch attempt at saving herself. Eleanor let the phone ring twice before picking it up. She didn't need to say much. She didn't need to explain herself. She'd already done that with the op-ed. And now it was Isabel's turn to face the consequences of her actions. "You're too late, Isabel," Eleanor said softly, her voice calm but final. "This time, it's over." The call ended with a soft click. The room felt quieter somehow, and yet, a weight had been lifted. Eleanor turned her gaze back to the window. The silhouette of the city now bathed in soft twilight. A new chapter was beginning. One where the truth would always stand firm, no matter how hard anyone tried to rewrite it. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of Eleanor's study, casting a warm golden light across the room. The stillness of the space was a contrast to the whirlwind that had become her life. The battle had been long, but the dust was beginning to settle. Isabel's rise and fall had played out in front of the city like a slow-motion crash. Now, there was a finality to it all, a sense of peace, even as Eleanor continued to wield her quiet power. But it wasn't just her legacy at stake anymore. It was Caroline's future. Eleanor sat at her desk, the pages of a donation letter in front of her. She read over it once, then twice, before signing her name at the bottom. The letter was simple, an anonymous donation to the private school where Caroline had attended. It was a gesture that would secure Caroline's scholarship, something that would remove her from the spotlight, from the drama that had threatened to engulf her. Eleanor had worked hard to keep her granddaughter out of the public eye, but the damage had been done. The school had already pulled Caroline out once, citing the public nature of the situation and the potential for emotional distress. But now, with the donation in place, the school would have no choice but to welcome Caroline back. It was a quiet act, but to Eleanor, it felt like a victory. One small, significant victory in the battle to protect Caroline from the wreckage caused by Isabel's ambition. Later that evening, at the annual benefit gala for the school, Eleanor arrived in her usual quiet way, unassuming but unmistakable. She moved through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries with old acquaintances, her elegant presence commanding subtle respect. The gala was always a grand affair, full of the city's elite. But tonight, Eleanor wasn't concerned with the crowds or the speeches. She wasn't interested in being the center of attention. Tonight, it was about Caroline's future. As Eleanor made her way through the room, she was met by the former headmistress of the school, a woman with whom Eleanor had worked closely in the past. The headmistress had always admired Eleanor's work, both in the design world and in the community. "Eleanor," the headmistress said, her voice warm and genuine, "I wanted to thank you, personally. Your donation means so much. You've secured Caroline's place here, and I can't tell you how much that means to us, to her future." Eleanor nodded, a small, proud smile playing at her lips. "It was the right thing to do," she said quietly. "Caroline deserves the opportunity, without the distractions. No one should pay for the mistakes of others." The headmistress smiled knowingly, her eyes glancing briefly at the crowd. "Indeed. And we're grateful to have her back." Just then, Eleanor noticed a shift in the room. The crowd's energy seemed to shift slightly, a collective murmur rising at the entrance. She turned to see Isabel entering, her presence as sharp and deliberate as ever. Isabel had been uninvited, of course. The school had quietly extended the invitation only to Eleanor, as they did not wish to bring any more drama to the evening. But Isabel had made her move anyway, trying to push her way into spaces where she no longer belonged. Eleanor watched with quiet detachment as Isabel made her way through the crowd, her gaze scanning the room. When she reached the center, she was greeted by staff with forced politeness, but there was no mistaking the underlying tension in the air. Eleanor didn't need to do anything. The staff had been briefed, and the protocol was clear. Isabel wasn't welcome here, not in this space, not anymore. A moment later, a staff member approached Isabel, speaking in hushed tones. Isabel's expression shifted from confident to confused, and then to one of frustration. The staff member gestured toward the door, and though Isabel tried to argue, it was clear that the matter had already been decided. Eleanor watched from the corner of the room, her gaze unwavering. She had seen this scene play out in her mind before, but now it was real. Isabel was being asked to leave, quietly but firmly. As Isabel left the gala, her heels clicking on the marble floor, Eleanor allowed herself a single breath, a quiet release of the tension she hadn't even realized she'd been holding. The woman who had tried so hard to take what wasn't hers, to control the narrative, was now being quietly ushered out. It was fitting. Isabel had always sought the spotlight, but now the spotlight was gone. It had turned, leaving her in the dark. Later that evening, as the gala wound down, Eleanor retreated to the quieter corners of the venue. Grace was there waiting for her, standing near the exit, a silent witness to the evening's unfolding drama. "Isabel was never meant to be part of this legacy," Grace said, her voice thoughtful. Eleanor nodded. No, but Caroline will be, and that's all that matters now. The next day, Eleanor met with Frank to finalize the estate updates. The properties, everything she had worked for, everything she had built, was now securely held in irrevocable trust, with Isabel permanently excluded. There was no turning back. Eleanor had made sure of that. But even as she secured the final details, there was still more to be done. Eleanor moved into her garden house, a place she had long kept for personal projects. The space had always been a haven, a place where she could create freely, without expectation. Now she began to transform it into something more, a design mentorship studio, a space for the next generation of designers to learn, to grow, to carry forward the legacy she had spent her life building. Caroline would be a part of it, of course. She had already begun to show promise, and Eleanor knew that one day, this would be her legacy too. The garden house would be where the next chapter began, where the future of Whitmore Interiors would be shaped, under the watchful eye of Eleanor and her granddaughter. And so, as the sun set on another day, Eleanor stood in the garden house, the quiet hum of the city outside barely reaching her ears. The past had been reclaimed, the present secured, and the future was already taking shape before her eyes. Isabel had played her hand, and now it was Eleanor's turn to guide the legacy forward. The game had changed, and this time, Eleanor was in control. Eleanor's study had transformed since Caroline began coming over regularly. What was once a room dedicated to the weighty decisions of the past now held the promise of the future. The drafts, the design materials, the books on architecture. Everything had been organized to include Caroline. The first day Eleanor handed her a pencil, the way Caroline's hand gripped it with both concentration and ease was a revelation. Eleanor had always been methodical in her design work, her approach to each project built from years of hard-won experience. But Caroline, she was different. Her work was born from a quiet confidence that spoke to her innate understanding of space, of light, of how a room could feel before it even existed. Today, they were sitting at the large oak table in the study. Carolyn was hunched over a sheet of drafting paper, sketching the first outlines of a floor plan. Eleanor was nearby, showing her how to layer materials, how to balance aesthetics with function, how to think about the stories a design could tell. "Do you know why this wall curves like that?" Eleanor asked, pointing to a section of Caroline's drawing. The line was fluid, graceful, a signature style Eleanor had honed over the years. It wasn't just about making something beautiful. It was about making something that felt beautiful. Caroline looked up, her eyes full of focus. "Because the space needs to flow. If it were straight, it would break the line of sight. It's like the room is trapped." Eleanor smiled, genuinely impressed. Exactly. The girl had a gift. Caroline's patience, something Isabel had never had, was something Eleanor recognized in herself when she had first started out. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't forced. Caroline worked slowly, carefully, with a level of understanding that Eleanor had to nurture in herself over time. It was as if Caroline understood instinctively that a great design didn't happen in a day. Weeks passed, and as Caroline's skills grew, so did her confidence. It was clear now that she was serious about this, in a way Isabel never had been. Isabel had always been interested in the spotlight, in how others viewed her, but Caroline wanted to build something. She didn't just want to be part of it. She wanted to create it. She wanted to help design the world around her. One afternoon, as Eleanor was preparing to leave for a meeting, Noah stopped by to check in. He had been keeping tabs on Caroline's progress, and she had become an unexpected asset to the firm. The work she was producing was fresh, thoughtful, and surprisingly polished for someone so young. He was the one who'd made the offer. "You know," Noah began, his tone casual but laced with seriousness, I've got a part-time internship available in the firm. If Caroline's interested, I'd like to offer her the position. Paid, of course. Eleanor paused, considering the offer. Caroline had been working hard, but this would be a big step. Her world would shift in ways she couldn't fully predict. But Eleanor knew Caroline had the fortitude to rise to it. When she told Caroline later that night, the girl's eyes lit up. Really? You mean it? Eleanor nodded, her voice steady. You've earned it, Caroline. This is your opportunity to learn from the best, and maybe teach us a thing or two. Caroline's hands shook slightly as she held the letter Noah had given her, but there was no mistaking the fire in her eyes. It feels like I'm helping build something, she said softly, her voice a mix of wonder and resolve, not just pose for it. It was a moment that cut through Eleanor's heart. She had spent her life building this, and now Caroline was stepping into it in a way that felt right. Not because of legacy, not because of what she should do, but because she truly wanted to contribute, to shape the future. But not everyone shared her excitement. A few days later, Isabel called, her tone sharp, controlled. I heard about the internship. Eleanor wasn't surprised. Isabel had a way of showing up when things didn't go her way. You let her take it? Isabel's voice was clipped, barely containing her frustration. She's only 12, Eleanor. She's supposed to be a child. And now she's working for you, learning the family business? The very business you've kept from me all these years? Eleanor's response was cool, deliberate. Caroline's already learning more than I ever could have taught her. She's a natural. But Isabel wasn't satisfied with that. She's not a designer, Eleanor. She's a child, and you've convinced her she can take over something she's not ready for. She's not meant for this life. Eleanor's lips tightened. She had expected this. Isabel had never truly seen Caroline for who she was. Not the girl with a future, but the girl who would always be in her shadow. And now, she was trying to pull her back. I think she's more than ready, Eleanor said, her voice steady. And if you think you're going to stop her, you're mistaken. Later, when Eleanor shared the call with Caroline, the young girl's face tightened, a spark of defiance lighting her eyes. She said I shouldn't be doing this. Eleanor gently cupped Caroline's chin, looking into her eyes. You don't need her approval, darling. You have your own path. You'll build it. Caroline's shoulders squared as she nodded. I know, Grandma. I'll keep going. I don't care what she thinks. It was clear that the line between mother and daughter was growing ever wider. Isabel's attempts to control Caroline, to pull her away from the family legacy, would only push her further into it. And this time, Eleanor would not back down. In the stillness of her study, Eleanor allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. Caroline's journey was just beginning. And Isabel? Isabel's attempts to rewrite history were already crumbling. The lanterns flickered softly in the warm Charleston dusk, casting ribbons of amber light across Eleanor's garden. The air smelled of rosemary and magnolia, the same scent that had lingered there for decades. Tonight wasn't meant to be extravagant. It was meant to be intentional. A small gathering. Trusted friends. Former clients. A handful of community leaders. Noah. Grace. And, most importantly, Caroline. Eleanor had spent the entire morning preparing the garden house, arranging chairs beneath the old oak tree, setting out glasses on the weathered table, and lining the walkway with candles that illuminated the space like a path to the future. Whitmore Interiors had been rebuilt on truth, reclaimed with purpose. And tonight, she would tell the world exactly where it was headed next. The guests mingled politely, their soft chatter blending with the cicadas. They knew Eleanor wasn't one for theatrics, so the invitation itself had piqued curiosity. But as they stood amidst the blossoms and the soft glow of lanterns, one thing became clear. This gathering meant something. Eleanor stepped forward, her presence commanding but warm, her posture tall beneath the shimmering lights. She tapped a silver spoon lightly against her glass, and the garden fell to a gentle hush. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice calm and steady. "For years, Whitmore Interiors has stood for craftsmanship, integrity, and the belief that good design tells a story, one built with patience, intention, and respect." She paused, her eyes moving through the crowd. "Tonight, I'm here not only to honor the past, but to open the door to the future." She gestured toward her side. From the garden house, Caroline emerged, her hands clasped in front of her, cheeks flushed in the soft light. She was no longer the unsure girl who'd first approached a drafting table. Tonight, her presence carried weight. "This is my granddaughter, Caroline Morris," Eleanor announced, her voice filled with quiet pride. "An apprentice of heritage and vision." The words rolled off her tongue naturally, as though she'd rehearsed them 100 times. "She has an eye for design that cannot be taught, a patience that few possess, and a heart that understands the stories spaces can hold." The crowd murmured with surprise and delight. Noah gave Caroline an encouraging nod. Grace lifted her glass, her eyes glinting with approval. Caroline took a small step forward, and though she fidgeted with the hem of her dress, her eyes stayed bright. If the evening had ended there, it would have been perfect. But Isabel, who had not been invited, had never been one to honor boundaries. Her heels clicked sharply against the flagstone path, cutting through the soft hum of conversation as she appeared at the garden gate. She was breathless, hair slightly disheveled, eyes wild with panic and disbelief. Not the poised woman she tried to present to the world, but the undone version she fought so hard to hide. "Mom!" Isabel snapped, stepping forward. "What is this? You didn't tell me about any—" Grace moved before Eleanor even had to speak. From her leather folder, she withdrew a crisp envelope and placed it firmly into Isabel's hand. "No contact order," Grace said coolly, "effective immediately. You are not permitted on the premises. Or at any Whitmore property." The crowd fell silent. Isabel's face went pale as she stared down at the document. "You can't be serious," she hissed. "You did this," Eleanor said softly, her tone calm, not spiteful, not angry, simply final. "You chose your seat at that dinner. Now sit in it." Doug appeared then, half hidden in the shadows near the trellis. He looked worn, rumpled, like he hadn't slept properly in days. Eleanor had heard he'd been sleeping in his office, the strain of Isabel's unraveling narrative pulling him deeper into ruin. He approached her quietly, the weight of regret in his eyes. "Eleanor, is there any way back?" he asked, voice low, almost pleading. "Any way to fix this?" Eleanor regarded him for a long moment. This man who had once pretended to respect her, who had encouraged Isabel's illusions, who had helped her twist Eleanor's legacy into something grotesque. "No, Doug," she said, her gaze steady. "Some doors shouldn't be reopened." Doug nodded once, shoulders sagging, and stepped away. The distance between them was irrevocable now, just another thing Isabel had lost without understanding why. Isabel stood frozen, fury and disbelief fighting across her face, but she could do nothing. Not here. Not tonight. Grace signaled to security, and Isabel was guided away from the garden, her protests fading into the night air. Silence settled again, tentative at first, then warm as people reclaimed the moment. Eleanor glanced at Caroline, whose eyes were wide but steady. The girl's hands clenched around the note cards she'd brought. "Are you still up for giving your speech?" Eleanor asked gently. Caroline swallowed, drew in a breath, and nodded. She stepped forward again, the soft lantern light catching on her hair as she faced the crowd. "Thank you for being here," she began, her voice small but certain. "I know I'm young, and I know I have a lot to learn, But my grandmother has taught me something important. She lifted her chin slightly. Legacy is something you earn, not inherit. The words cut cleanly through the garden. Simple, true, unflinching. Eleanor felt her chest swell with something deep, proud, and achingly tender. Caroline wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't afraid. She was stepping into her future with clarity, with strength. The garden erupted into gentle applause. Caroline exhaled shakily, a smile creeping across her face as she stepped back beside Eleanor. But as the applause faded, Eleanor's gaze drifted toward the shadows at the edge of the property, where the lingering shape of Isabel had disappeared moments before. The night felt settled, but Eleanor knew better. Isabel wasn't finished. Not yet. The Preservation Gala was one of Charleston's most anticipated events, a night where the city's elite gathered to celebrate its rich history, its architectural landmarks, and the people who had shaped its culture. For years, it had been an affair dominated by the old guard, those with wealth, those with power, those who had inherited Charleston's legacy. And for decades, Eleanor had watched from the shadows, a silent architect of the city's design world, respected by those who knew her, but never truly recognized in the way she deserved. But tonight, that was about to change. As Eleanor stood before the mirror in her home, adjusting the strands of pearls around her neck, the soft hum of the city beyond her windows seemed to pause. Her fingers traced the delicate fabric of her 1983 couture gown, a piece she had worn at the height of her career when the world had first taken notice of her designs. The gown, timeless, classic, was as much a statement as her work had been. It was her past, but it was also her present. And tonight, it would serve as her declaration that the legacy she had built was hers, to guide, to shape, and to defend. She had come a long way from those early days, when her name was barely spoken in the same rooms as those who claimed power over Charleston's fate. Eleanor had built this city in her image. She had reshaped its homes, its buildings, its very fabric. Now she was going to stand before the people who had once overlooked her and claim her rightful place. When she arrived at the gala, the room fell silent. The soft murmur of conversation halted. Every head turned. They were not expecting her. Not in this way, not as the matriarch of Charleston design. But there she was, in her 1983 couture, her presence as commanding as the designs she had created decades ago. The room rose to its feet as she made her way to the stage, the soft click of her heels against the marble floor, a steady rhythm that pulsed through the space. It was a power she had earned, a presence that could not be denied. The applause was slow at first, hesitant even, but it grew louder, more certain, until the entire room was clapping. Caroline watched from the front row, her eyes wide with admiration, her notebook open in her lap. She had seen her grandmother in countless moments of quiet power, but never like this. Never as the person everyone in this room was now acknowledging as the force behind so much of the city's soul. When Eleanor reached the podium, she paused, her eyes sweeping across the room. Her gaze held no malice, no desire for revenge. It was calm, controlled, exactly as she had always been. She placed her hands on the podium, her fingers lingering for just a moment as she prepared herself. And then, she spoke. "There are many ways to define a city," Eleanor began, her voice clear and steady. "Some say it's the buildings that line the streets, the homes that rise from the soil like dreams turned to stone. Others say it's the people, the ones who live, love, and leave their mark on the world." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "But I believe it is the spaces we create that define us. Not just in design, but in life. What we build with love must be guarded from ego." The words echoed through the hall, and for a moment, it felt as if the entire room had become still, absorbing her message, feeling the truth of it resonate deep within them. Eleanor spoke no names. She didn't need to. There was no need to drag the past through the mud. She had already claimed it, reshaped it, made it hers. The message was clear, even if it wasn't spoken outright. Caroline's grip tightened on her notebook, her heart swelling with pride. She had known, of course, that her grandmother was the heart of Charleston's design legacy, but to hear the words spoken so publicly, so boldly, it made it real. Eleanor was no longer the behind-the-scenes figure. She was at the forefront, taking back what had always been hers. As Eleanor continued, her words flowing like water, Caroline couldn't help but think back to everything that had led them here. She thought of the years of work, the quiet moments in the study, the sketches, the designs. She thought of the many people who had tried to write Eleanor out of history, who had claimed her work as their own. And yet, here she was, standing in front of them, unbowed. "It is not enough," Eleanor continued, her eyes never leaving the audience, "to inherit a legacy. It must be earned through hard work, dedication, and respect for what came before. My work, my designs, my legacy, they are not for sale. They are not to be erased, and they are not for those who would take them without understanding the blood, the sweat, and the years of love that built them." The crowd had gone completely silent, every word from Eleanor hanging in the air like the final stroke of a masterpiece. Caroline's chest tightened, the weight of her grandmother's words settling into her bones. This was the woman who had built everything from the ground up. This was the woman who would never let anyone take it from her. As Eleanor concluded, the applause that followed was deafening. The sound reverberated through the hall, a final confirmation of what had been claimed, what had been taken back. Caroline stood, joining the standing ovation, her heart beating with pride for the woman who had shaped her life, her future, her everything. In that moment, she knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that this was her future too. She would carry the legacy forward. She would build something new, something lasting, something that no one could take from her. The night had only just begun, but Eleanor's place in Charleston's history had been solidified, and with it, the future of Whitmore Interiors. It was clear now, there was no one who could stand in her way. As the applause faded, Eleanor turned toward the exit, where a familiar face lingered in the shadows. Isabel. Eleanor's gaze locked on hers for a moment, a single exchange between them. Isabel stood frozen, her face pale with the weight of everything she had lost. But Eleanor didn't need to say a word. Isabel already knew. The future was already written. And Isabel, as always, had been left behind. The early morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Eleanor's study, casting long, sharp shadows across the room. A low hum of activity from the city below seeped in, but it didn't matter. Eleanor was already in her element, her mind focused on what had to be done next. She had spent decades shaping the world around her, and now, with every step she took, she was ensuring that it would remain hers, forever. Frank and Grace had arrived just as the light turned golden, both of them with that knowing look they had shared for years, the look that said they knew what had to be done and what couldn't be undone. Frank took a seat at the long oak table, pulling a thick folder from his briefcase. Eleanor sat across from him, her hands clasped in front of her, eyes steady. She was no longer the woman trying to earn her place in the world. Tonight, after her speech, that battle was over. She had reclaimed it all, her legacy, her work, and now, her future. "We've taken care of the trust," Frank said, flipping open the folder. "It's officially been moved to an independent fiduciary. There's no more room for error. Your estate's secure." Eleanor nodded, her lips curling into a slight smile. The trust, once something she had kept close, was now untouchable. The legal documents were carefully worded, airtight. Isabel had no power over any of it anymore, despite her efforts to convince the world otherwise. Grace, who had been standing nearby, watching over the proceedings with a quiet, discerning eye, stepped forward. "Isabel's legal motion was filed yesterday," she said, glancing at Frank. "It's already been denied. The judge ruled in under 48 hours. She didn't even read the fine print of the trust documents. She thought she could claim everything just by showing up. But she didn't bother to read what you had already set in motion." Eleanor's face softened as she leaned back in her chair. For all Isabel's arrogance, for all her attempts to take what wasn't hers, she had overlooked the one thing that would have saved her. The years of careful planning Eleanor had put in long before she ever thought to challenge her mother's place in Charleston's legacy. Frank passed over a letter for Eleanor to sign, a statement of finality, one that would put an end to any further action from Isabel. It was a formal declaration, brief and to the point. "There will be no further comment," it read, closing the door on Isabel's last-ditch efforts to rewrite the narrative. Eleanor's fingers lingered on the pen as she signed. She had never been one to bask in public spectacle. The statement was her final word. She wasn't going to waste any more of her energy on a daughter who had failed to understand what it truly meant to build something that lasted. As Eleanor signed, her mind briefly drifted to Caroline, to the future that awaited her. It was Caroline who had learned the lessons Isabel never had. It was Caroline who would take up the mantle, not just in the family business, but in the city that Eleanor had crafted, with both her hands and her heart. As she signed, her gaze moved to the window, and for a moment, Eleanor thought she saw the future stretching before her, clearer and more certain than ever before. The phone rang, snapping her from her thoughts. Frank answered, his voice steady, professional. "Doug?" he said into the receiver, his tone softening slightly. "Yes, I understand." He glanced up at Eleanor, his eyes betraying a hint of sympathy. "Doug's filing for separation from Isabel. He's already moving out of the house. It's over for them." Eleanor's face remained impassive, but her fingers tightened around the pen. Isabel's world was crumbling, piece by piece. Doug's separation wasn't surprising. After all, it was Doug who had clung to the remnants of a marriage that had never been based on anything real. Now he was walking away from the last of it. "Let him go," Eleanor said softly, her voice like steel. "It's time for him to choose his seat at the table. If he didn't choose it earlier, that's his loss." After the call ended, Eleanor turned back to the task at hand, the finality of everything settling in. Isabel had no place here anymore, not in the business, not in the family's legacy. Not in the life Eleanor had built with her own two hands. That night, as Eleanor was finishing a quiet dinner with Caroline, a knock at the door interrupted the calm. It was Noah, holding an envelope in his hand, his face breaking into a quiet smile when he saw Caroline. "I've got something for you," he said, his tone light. "It's official now. Your first paycheck. Thought you might like to frame it." Caroline's eyes went wide as Noah handed her the envelope. The weight of it was symbolic. More than just money. It was her first step into the future that Eleanor had created for her, the future she would help guide. The one Isabel would never touch. Caroline held the envelope in her hands for a moment, savoring the moment. She glanced up at Eleanor, her eyes full of gratitude. Eleanor smiled, a quiet but deep pride blooming in her chest. "Thank you, Noah," Caroline whispered, her voice filled with emotion. As Caroline opened the envelope, Eleanor stood and walked to the window, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. The storm had passed. Isabel was out. Doug was gone. The trust was secure. And now, with Caroline by her side, the legacy was safe. The paperwork was done. The story was written. And nothing at all, could take that from them now. The final signature was placed with deliberate precision, the pen moving in a slow arc across the page. Eleanor's hand didn't waver. Her resolve had been steady throughout. She had spent years crafting this moment, her last act of control over the life she had built. And now, with this one decision, everything was locked down. The final clause of her trust was signed. Isabel would never have access again. Eleanor sat back in her chair, the weight of the document resting heavily on her desk, but the satisfaction it brought was palpable. The legacy was sealed. The house, the firm, the entire estate, all of it was protected. Isabel, with all her ambitions and false claims, had no part in it. Not anymore. There were no second chances, no room for mistakes. It was finished. In the quiet of the room, Eleanor allowed herself a moment to feel the full weight of the years that had passed. For all the hardship, the pain, the betrayal, this moment made it all worth it. She had built something real, and no one could take that from her. From the corner of the room, Grace placed a thick, neatly folded document in front of her. It was the paperwork that finalized Caroline's future, the terms of her succession as trustee. At 18, Caroline would take the reins, guided by both Eleanor's steady hand and Noah's wisdom. It was a move that would ensure the continuity of Whitmore Interiors, the family's legacy, and the work that Eleanor had spent her life perfecting. Caroline would lead, but not without guidance. Grace and Noah had both agreed to mentor her, ensuring that her talent was nurtured, her confidence strengthened. Caroline had earned her place, not through inheritance, but through grit, determination, and a gift that couldn't be ignored. Eleanor had no doubt that she would rise to the challenge. The room seemed to hum with the silence that followed, the quiet certainty of it all. Eleanor's gaze moved to the window, where the late afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows over the city that she had reshaped. The weight of the world outside seemed a million miles away. Inside, the legacy was safe. Just as Eleanor was about to rise from her chair, the soft sound of a letter landing on her desk interrupted her thoughts. She opened it carefully, her fingers pausing for just a moment before she began to read. It was from her late husband's alma mater. The endowment she had set up in his name was officially fully funded. The college had already begun its work, providing scholarships for those in need. It was his legacy now, carried forward by her, as she had carried their shared dream. Eleanor pressed the letter to her chest, her eyes closing briefly in quiet gratitude. There had been so much she had done in his memory, so much that had been built between them. His presence lingered in every project, every design, every decision. And now, with this, it was as if she had fulfilled the last of their promises. Her gaze shifted again to Caroline, who had quietly entered the room, her presence always grounding, always steady. Caroline had become the anchor in a sea of chaos, her steady hands now shaping the future that Eleanor had fought to create. Caroline's eyes flicked to the documents on the table. She hadn't asked, but Eleanor could see the unspoken question in her gaze. "Do you know what this means?" Eleanor asked, her voice soft. Caroline nodded slowly. "It's everything you've built, Grandma. It's everything." Her voice was steady, but the weight of it was clear in her eyes. Eleanor gave a small smile, her heart swelling. "It's yours now, too." And with that, the last chapter of their story together began. Later that evening, as the night settled in and the city lights twinkled from the windows of the Whitmore estate, Eleanor watched as Caroline sat down at the desk, a new notebook in her hands. She opened it to the first page, her pencil poised above the blank paper. On the cover, Caroline had written, "From Grandmother's Studio." The words seemed to echo in the quiet of the room, "From Grandmother's Studio." It was as if the world had already started to shift in their favor, and from here, there was nothing to stop it. The future, now in Caroline's hands, was hers to shape. Eleanor stood in the doorway, watching as her granddaughter dipped her pencil to paper, creating something new, something that would carry the legacy forward. It had all come full circle. As the clock ticked softly in the background, Eleanor whispered to herself. During dinner, my daughter said, "You're not needed here." So I removed her from everything that was mine and gave it to someone who never had to ask. The finality of it all settled over her like a soft wave, and for the first time in years, Eleanor allowed herself to feel peace.